Weitz-Shapiro to start her talk.
Great. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you everyone for being here, especially at this point in the semester when I know there's a lot of Zoom fatigue and just fatigue in general. So what I'm going to be presenting today, as was already mentioned, is a project that builds on a field experiment in Argentina. You can see the title up here, and this is joint work with Ana de la O from Yale and Lucas Gonzalez at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín in Buenos Aires province in Argentina. So I'm gonna start with sort of a little bit of information on the site in which we're working. So this project focuses on school principals and the school free meal program in the province of Chaco in the northeast of Argentina, here highlighted in green on the border with Paraguay. So we're going to be looking at this school free meal program. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of what these, meals and the meal preparation areas look like in schools in the province. So this gives you some sense of the diversity in terms of the settings in which meals are presented, from a wood burning traditional stove to a pretty modern setting, to probably the most typical is in the upper left, where we see sort of a makeshift meal preparation area with portable gas canisters. The other thing in the lower left, for anyone who's worked at all in Argentina, will be very familiar.
Excuse me, Rebecca.
Yeah.
We're not seeing your slide.
What happened? Oh yeah, my screen unshared. Let me try again. Do you see it now?
All set. All set.
Okay. I'm going to keep it here. I think it's something about the full page that sometimes changes its mind. So here we see the food preparation areas. Now you all can see it. And yeah, I wanted to call your attention to the lower left. We have lots and lots of yerba mate, right? Which is very common caffeine-laden tea in Argentina. And it is actually sort of the most constant thing that's served in schools as well, cooked with milk, with the milk being sort of a crucial nutritional aspect of school meals, but that's a constant in school meals in the northeast of Argentina. So what are we interested in? Yamila mentioned that I have done and I'm doing now a lot of work on corruption, but in this project we're looking a little bit differently, not at corruption, but actually more at a bureaucratic effort. So just to give you a sense of this, we know from our qualitative interviews with school principals and Ministry of Education officials that there's a lot of variation in school principal effort and motivation in general, obviously, but also, and perhaps especially with respect to the meal program, which of course is a task that school principals are tasked with above and beyond their normal sort of pedagogical and supervisory tasks. And so as one school principal told us, there are directors, school principals who are concerned with the meal program and others who aren't. So why is that? And is there anything that the government can do that might increase motivation and effort in the school meal program? So that gets us to our big picture motivation and question for this project. So we know that frontline service providers, that's the FLSP there, or street level bureaucrats, as Michael Lipsky called them, are how citizens experience the state. And as your colleague Tom Popinski has pointed out, they've become a central plank in the global development agenda over the past 30 years. We also know that these street level bureaucrats have their own preferences over how much effort to exert in their work, and they enjoy a lot of discretion over their day-to-day tasks, precisely because they are working at the street level with citizens directly, and often away from any direct supervision from their own supervisors. In lower and middle income countries, on top of this, these frontline service providers are often working in quite severely resource constrained contexts, and additionally with few opportunities for career advancement or any sort of remuneration or other forms of acknowledgement of a job well done. So in this type of context, how can governments motivate these frontline service providers to exert more effort in their work? So that's the big picture question driving this research project. To give you a preview of our theory and findings before I dig into all of this in more detail, we argue in this paper that voluntary, rather than the traditional and conventional mandatory form of oversight, may actually motivate these street-level bureaucrats by giving them autonomy and a sense of competence. And so to test that theory, we implement a field experiment with an encouragement design. I'll get into what that means a little bit later, where we basically invite school principals to receive an audit, which they can choose to accept or not. And to do that, we work with a provincial auditing office in the province of Chaco, the Tribunal de Cuentas. In terms of our findings, so just descriptively, and we think pretty interestingly, about 1/3 of school principals actually accept this invitation to volunteer for an audit from the tribunal. And we see divergent effects of the invitation to the audit based on the density of invitations. And I'll get into that a little bit more too. But we see sort of our expected motivating effects of a voluntary audit in areas where relatively few school principals were invited, but we see actually perverse effects in areas where many school principals were invited. And so we use these divergent results as an opportunity to think a little bit about the collective dynamics of choice and what it means really to be invited to participate in a form of oversight. I should say at this juncture that this is very much in working paper form at this moment. So if you're interested in taking a look at the paper, just send me an email. I'd be happy to share it with you and to get any feedback above and beyond the discussion that we have today. So this is just a brief outline of the rest of the talk, and I'll try and be pretty concise so that we have lots of time for Q&A at the end. So starting with the theory, why might voluntary oversight motivate frontline service providers to exert more effort in their jobs? So to think about this, we start by contrasting what we call the principal agent framework, which dominates sort of most of our understanding and most of our theorizing about how bureaucrats work, versus a more psychological framework. So principal agent framework, which again is a dominant approach in economics and political science, emphasizes that the way to get agents, in this case bureaucrats, to perform their jobs is through some combination of monitoring, incentives, and risk of punitive action. So there's a lot of research on this, especially in recent years from development economics, a number of field experiments that show on the whole pretty mixed results. So in some cases, it does seem like some mixture of monitoring, incentives, risk of punishment does lead to better performance. For example, getting teachers to show up more in schools or healthcare providers at the local health clinic. But a number of these studies also show rather mixed results. So the Banerjee et al., for example, show a monitoring in India that a monitoring system worked to a point until bureaucrats and their supervisors basically found a way to collude to get around that monitoring. We also see evidence from other papers that sometimes these types of monitoring or incentive systems cause bureaucrats either to exert effort only in the area that's being monitored, and we know that bureaucrats do a whole host of things, or sometimes to shift effort away from the area that's being monitored so that they can't be caught with malfeasance in that area. So on the whole, although this is our dominant sort of theoretical framework in the social sciences, actual empirical evidence shows that often this type of oversight of street-level bureaucrats has mixed results. So we start from a different approach, which is a psychological framework, which draws heavily from the psychology literature that thinks about how individuals are motivated in the first place, individuals in their jobs, in their lives, and to some extent specifically bureaucrats. But we know from work by Deci and Ryan in particular that individuals value tasks, not only jobs, but including jobs, that provide them with a sense of autonomy, relatedness to others, and competence. And we do know from some work from economics and public administration that in general people exert more effort and experience greater job satisfaction and motivation in jobs that address these needs. So we argue that voluntary oversight is going to appeal particularly to two of those fundamental needs, a desire for a sense of autonomy and for feeling competent in one's work. So why is that? We argue that beginning with autonomy, voluntary oversight, that is asking bureaucrats whether they would like to receive oversight or not, inherently gives them choice and an opportunity for self-direction, which again, for frontline bureaucrats, is something that sort of runs contrary to sort of traditional forms of oversight. We also think that voluntary oversight can foster a sense of competence through a few different ways. First of all, the act of volunteering itself is an act that a bureaucrat can feel proud of. It's an action the bureaucrat takes. And that could give them both sort of a personal sense of accomplishment as well as some social recognition. That is, even if you were to have an audit and have a positive result, the fact of having volunteered for that audit may give a bureaucrat sort of additional recognition, both personal and social. It also serves as a recognition of the expertise of frontline service providers. And the Schuster piece that I cited on the previous slide talks about this quite a lot, how for many frontline service providers, there's a real desire to share information and expertise up the hierarchy, up the bureaucratic hierarchy, but often very little opportunity to do that. So again, being asked to volunteer may be understood as a form of sort of asking to share a frontline service provider's own expertise and experiences up the hierarchy of bureaucratic oversight. And qualitative evidence from our case shows that for a lot of principals, this was pretty important, actually. Then we know from existing literature that autonomy and competence can increase motivation, especially intrinsic motivation. And so we expect that voluntary audits might increase intrinsic motivation among frontline service providers. And then if that proves to be true, may also affect behavior and, in our case, school level outcomes. So before I turn to the experiment and the data, I want to talk a little bit more about the bureaucratic and social context in which we're operating. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're working in the province of Chaco in Argentina's northeast. Argentina is obviously a middle-income country. Chaco looks a little bit more like a lower middle-income country in the context of Argentina. So it's one of the poorest provinces in the country with GDP per capita less than half the national average. About a quarter of households are classified as poor using the most common metric in Argentina, unsatisfied basic needs. And it's one of the sort of few places in Argentina where both undernutrition, or what was traditionally called malnutrition, and obesity in children are prevalent. So like many middle-income countries, overweight or obesity is increasingly a concern in Argentina. And Chaco is one of the places where both that and more traditional malnutrition or undernutrition is a concern. In addition, the province's students test poorly in national school exams. So it's, again, looking sort of worse than the national average in a lot of respects. For that reason, then, not surprisingly, most people we spoke to in the province really emphasized the importance of the school free meal program. It's part of a national anti-hunger program, and actually, in my dissertation project, which became the book that was mentioned before, I studied another aspect of this national anti-hunger program. So this part of the program focuses on meals in schools, obviously, and school principals, again, are responsible above and beyond their sort of real job, right? Pedagogical oversight of teachers, supervising teachers, running the school. They're responsible for running this meal program. And that includes managing foodstuffs and coordinating and overseeing food preparation and distribution. And this is a substantial job because it's widely agreed that funding for the program is insufficient. And the program actually makes it against program rules to fund staff to prepare the food. So what most principals do is they have to sort of manage some combination of staff and volunteers from the community to actually prepare and serve food to children. Just impressionistically, from the field, it seems like what most principals do is ask women, mothers, or grandmothers in the community to take on that task in exchange for being able to take home food themselves, which is against program rules because the food is only supposed to be funded for children, but that's what happens on the ground. What about the bureaucratic context? So again, I don't think this is an unusual bureaucracy in that it's a pretty rule-bound and hierarchical context where advancement for school teachers and principal is strictly linked to exams and seniority. Now, on the positive, from our qualitative work, we didn't have any indication that these rules and exam seniority are frequently corrupted by sort of side payments or nepotism or anything like this. I'm sure that happens occasionally, but the sense is this is a very rule-bound system. So that's on the plus side, that it can't really be subverted. On the negative, principals repeatedly told us that there's few or almost no opportunities for recognition of their effort on the job or their job performance, actually. So as one principal told us, you can be a great principal in the way you do your work, but they don't take it into account. If you go and you do poorly on the test, you don't get promoted. They don't link your performance on the job with the test. Additionally, another common complaint among school principals was that they have little opportunity for input into policy, and that higher ups in the Ministry of Education at the provincial level, not to mention the national level, are really unaware of how difficult the situation is on the ground. One principal told us again, creo que están ajeno a la realidad, right? They're just, the people at the top are really distant from reality. They don't understand what's going on. And perhaps not surprisingly, as a result, principals reported in our N-line survey, which I'll get to in a minute, feeling much more accountable to parents, students, and teachers than to the Provincial Ministry of Education or the provincial auditing body. Although their advancement is very strictly rule-bound, in terms of their actual performance, they feel more obligated to other members of the school community. So moving now to our empirical strategy. Again, our goal here was to examine whether the opportunity for voluntary oversight would lead to higher levels of motivation and effort among school principals. So to do that, we worked with the Tribunal de Cuentas, the provincial auditing office, to conduct a field experiment in the province, where these audits were focused specifically on the administration of the free meal program. That is possible because the provincial auditing office has purview to audit programs that receive funds from the national government, which the meal program does. The intervention followed an encouragement design. I'll get to that in 1 minute. And then we measured the impact on school principal outcomes with an N-line survey that ultimately took place 8 months after the intervention. So it was supposed to be a little bit closer in time, but we got caught up with a lot of administrative hurdles and then the summer vacation in Argentina. in January and February. So we ended up measuring our outcomes quite a bit after the actual intervention. So that raises some concerns. On the other hand, it suggests that anything we do find is actually quite persistent, quite lasting. And then I'll just say we have a little bit of administrative data on school closings, days where the school records that nobody attended. And though we asked that on the survey 8 months after the intervention, that data comes from contemporaneous records that the school principals consulted during our online survey. So what is an encouragement design? What do we mean by that exactly? So basically, the Provincial Auditing Office sent an invitation to the Voluntary Audits program to all of the schools that were assigned to the treatment condition. This invitation letter included an acknowledgement of the social importance of the program, an opportunity to volunteer for the audit, and also said that the audit would come with an official document that the principals would have that attested to their participation in this voluntary audit. All the school principals who replied to the letter saying they did want to volunteer actually received the audit, the voluntary audit. And the control group, the rest of the schools, remained in the status quo. And what is that status quo situation? So all schools always face the risk of some audit, but it is admittedly extremely small. So this year, the year that we ran the study, for example, the Tribunal audited of schools in our control group, something like 3% of schools. And frankly, that might even be high for a year-over-year comparison based on our discussions with them. So in the control group, they faced a risk of a mandatory audit, which they can't refuse if the staff shows up at their school, but it's a pretty low risk. So who is in our sample? So our sample is basically a convenience sample. We were basically constrained by the Provincial Auditing Office's human capacity to run audits, how many audits they could run. We helped fund these additional audits, which were more than they would normally run, by basically paying for the additional costs of gas and sort of mileage that they would have to go. And so we took basically preschools and public preschools and primary schools within a day's drive of the provincial capital, and divided them into 13 regions, either based on municipality, or we divided the capital city into geographically compact areas. We then assigned these regions to either a high or a low density treatment group with a probability of 1/2. And then within each region, we randomly assigned schools to treatment, that is to receive this invitation to a voluntary audit or to the control group. So in the high density regions, half the schools got the letter, and in the low density regions, only 16% of schools got the letter. So we had 188 schools in total, and ultimately 126 were assigned to control, and 62 schools received the letter. So we think of it as an encouragement design because the letter is an encouragement to receive the audit, but not to volunteer, but not all schools who receive it actually volunteer. So why might school principals choose to accept or decline the invitation? And these are just from qualitative interviews with school principals that we did after the final online survey. So this isn't systematic, but it gives you sort of a little sense of the preview about the different effects that this invitation might have. So a lot of the reasons that school principals mentioned that either they accepted if they were in the treatment group, or that a principal might accept because we also gave them a hypothetical scenario if they were in the control group, was pride in a job well done. So sort of self-recognition, social recognition in terms of showing things to the parents. And again, when I previewed before, the desire to give feedback to those higher up in the bureaucratic hierarchy whom might be unaware of how difficult the job is that they are asked to do. In terms of reasons to decline, a number of principals, especially in response to our hypotheticals, said they themselves would accept, but other people might decline. And those reasons included skepticism over whether this could make any difference. So many people thought that it wasn't going to help with anything. And another really frequently mentioned thing was workload. Again, the school meal program is already sort of asking principals to do something above and beyond their core tasks, and accepting an audit team visit would mean an additional responsibility. I won't go through the randomization check here, but I can come back to this in the Q&A if you would like. But I want to make sure I have time to move on to the results. So what's our empirical strategy for analyzing the study? So we're going to be examining what we call intent, and I'm going to be showing you what we call intent to treat estimates. So basically, I'm going to show you results where we compare treatment schools versus control schools. That is, schools that received the invitation, regardless of whether they accepted it, and schools in the control. So that is because, of course, it's possible that schools that accepted the invitation are different than those that chose not to. And so we might be worried if we just compare schools that accepted the treatment with other schools that we're not comparing like to like. Because schools were randomly assigned to either receive the invitation or not, by comparing schools assigned to receive the invitation and those assigned to control, we can be confident that the mix of schools in expectation, principal motivation, effort, and so on will be indistinguishable between our two groups. We're also going to include an indicator variable for the high density regions, and then an interaction between treated schools and high density regions. So again, remember we have this sort of two-level structure where we first assigned regions to either have a high density of invitations or low density of invitations, and then we assign schools to receive the letter or not. And our original thinking here was that there might be spillover where in high density regions, other school principals who didn't receive the invitation would have heard of it through WhatsApp groups primarily, but also through other social networks or direct communication, and they might be motivated. They might anticipate getting a letter, might be motivated to sort of work harder, and that we therefore might see sort of treatment and control schools in high density look more similarly. We don't find that, but that was a motivation. We find some other things, as I said before. In terms of our outcomes of interest, in the paper we talk more broadly about some other things that we also looked at, but here I'm going to focus on 3 outcomes. The first is motivation. Looking at both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So here we asked 15 items total for each of the meal program and a placebo supervising teachers, and we asked principals to respond with how much they agreed on a scale of 1 to 4, with a bunch of statements that explained why they spend time either on the meal program or supervising teachers. And then we draw heavily on the work of Ryan and Deci and adapt it to this particular empirical context. But to give you a sense of what an intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation measure is, and we establish these ahead of time, an intrinsic measure is, I spend time on the meal program because I'm interested in understanding how the school canteen works. How much do you agree on a scale of 1 to 4? And an example of an extrinsic motivation is I spend time on the program because I could get a reward. We also have data on self-reported hours worked, and which is, again, takes place, both the motivation and the hours work are reporting principals' motivation and hours 8 months after the intervention. And then on the number of days where there is 0 recorded attendance at the school. And those are collected at 8 months afterwards, but they're from contemporary record books. Just to give you first a quick sense that even 8 months later, we can see some effect from this intervention. I'll just show you some descriptive data on the extent to which principals mentioned the Provincial Auditing Office as one of their top 3 audiences at the moment when they think about accountability of rendición de cuentas. So we asked principals, who's most important when you think about accountability? priority for your school. And interestingly, nobody mentioned as most important the provincial auditing office. And out of our 180 schools for which we collected data at Nline, 7 schools list the PAO in their top 3. We do see a difference in the expected direction between control and treatment. So 3 out of our 117 schools in control list the PAO, and 4 out of our 60 schools in treatment. So I have the results in the paper, but not here. But when we regress this outcome on treatment, when we have control selected via lasso, this difference is significant at the 0.1 level. So this is at least pretty suggestive that even 8 months after the fact, that the provincial auditing office's presence 8 months prior continues to have an effect on school principals. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to try and go through these in about 5 minutes, looking at the effects of voluntary audits on external and internal, or extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So I want to first draw your attention to columns 5 through 8, which again are our placebo test. So basically we see that the intervention had no effect on principals' reported motivation to supervise teachers. So that's what we expected. So I just want to highlight that. Then I want to turn to columns 3 and 4. So in column 3, we do not include the interaction for the density of invitations. And we see basically that schools assigned to treatment don't seem to have any different, significantly different levels of motivation to work in the meal program than those assigned to control. Once we look in column 4, we see a different story. So here our comparison group are control schools in low density areas. And so if we look at our very first row, we see that treatment schools in low density areas report, those principals report higher levels of intrinsic motivation to work in the meal program. So that's an increase of 0.35 points on a 4-point scale. So substantively, a pretty significant effect. What we see on the other hand, though, and you see that in the third row, is that in high density localities, actually schools assigned to treatment, those principals actually report lower levels of motivation to work in the meal program. And that is also a statistically significant effect. When we look at columns 1 and 2, we see a similar pattern, although in columns 2, not all these coefficients are reaching statistical significance. But again, the pattern seems to be that schools that receive the invitation in low density areas report higher levels of motivation to work in the lunch program, whereas schools that receive the invitation in high density areas I maybe misspoke. So treatment schools in low density report higher motivation, and treatment schools in high density report lower motivation. Quickly turning to hours worked, again, recalling that this is 8 months later, none of these results are significant, but I want to call your attention to the columns 3 and 4 again, hours worked in the lunch program, to just suggest, especially in column 4, we see the same pattern. So again, school principals report on average working about 5 hours a week on the school lunch program. So it's a pretty significant chunk of time considering they report working about 46 hours a week on average. And again, although they don't achieve levels of statistical significance, we see the same pattern here, that treatment schools in low density areas report working more hours than control schools, whereas treatment schools, those principals in low density areas, report working fewer hours on the meal program. Finally, we're going to look at data on school closings. And so again, this is data that's collected from contemporaneous records. And basically, we're going to treat a school closing as a day where there's no attendance recorded, even though the school was supposed to be open. So it wasn't a holiday or something like that. And once again, we see this similar pattern that it seemed, again, here school closing is like a negative outcome. So the signs are reversed. But we see that it appears that treatment schools in low density areas have fewer school closings, whereas treatment schools in high density areas actually have more school closings. And again, if we look at column 4, this seems to be mostly concentrated in the couple weeks after the audit. So we're seeing this picture overall. Well, I'll get to it in a second. So first of all, I should have noted about 1/3 of schools overall accept the invitation to participate in the audit. So we view that as a pretty high rate. So I'm curious to hear feedback on that. Just given the principal agent framework, which dominates, would suggest, I think, that bureaucrats should resist oversight. And so if they were asked to volunteer for it, that they would decline. So we think about 1/3 of principals is a pretty high rate. We see the effect that we anticipated, which is that getting the invitation to participate in the audit is associated with an increase in motivation and a decrease in school closings, but only in areas where the density of invitations was relatively low. In contrast, we see this opposite and almost, I think perverse effect in areas where many principals receive the invitation. So in those cases, receiving the invitation causes a decrease in principal motivation and an increase in school closings. And again, I just want to highlight that these effects of motivation are documented 8 months after the intervention. So they are quite enduring. So what do we make of all of this? And I'll be very curious to hear your thoughts and comments and feedback. So for thinking about this, we've been thinking a lot about the collective dynamics of individual choice and what it means to really to be asked to volunteer. When is volunteering really voluntary? One thing that's interesting here is that we see differential take up of the invitation in our different regions. So in areas where many principals were invited, many more accepted the invitation. So about 45% of principals accepted the invitation in settings where many principals were invited, whereas only about 1/4 accepted the invitation in low density regions. And here we speculate that there might be actually pressure to accept the invitation when the density of invitations is higher. So again, we can't unfortunately we don't have systematic qualitative evidence, but in speaking to some principals who received the invitation, some of them recalled the voluntary nature of the invitation, but others did not. Right? So it's possible, we know that principals are in communication with each other in WhatsApp groups in particular. And it's possible that when principals saw that many principals were receiving the invitation, that some felt pressure to accept the invitation or didn't understand it as truly voluntary, right? The letter said it was voluntary, but it also came from the provincial auditing office. So one could imagine that some principals might have some doubt about how voluntary it was. And if all the principals or many principals are reporting receiving it, they might perceive it as less voluntary. And some may therefore accept it, even though they wouldn't otherwise prefer to. And in those cases, we might think that the experience of the audit is actually negative and disappointing for those who are reluctant to accept. If for those who accepted sort of under some felt social pressure, it might be that having the audit team, their intrusion into looking through their paperwork, their demands on their time are actually a negative experience that makes school principals actually less motivated and less desirous of spending time on this program. It might also make them believe that they're unlikely to face oversight again in the future, which might be another possible explanation for why we see this sort of drop off in effort after the audit has taken place. So that's where I want to end up here today, and I welcome comments and questions. Thanks very much.